Furious, the billionaire CEO tosses the positive pregnancy test in the trash, dismissing it as a cruel joke. But the following day, a phone call shatters his confidence and leaves him utterly speechless. The office of Alexander Thorne, perched high above the city in the gleaming Thorne Tower, was a picture of cold, calculated perfection. A wall of glass overlooked the skyline, and every surface gleamed with polished steel and black marble. It was an office designed to intimidate, a reflection of its occupant. Alexander was no stranger to the cutthroat world of corporate empires, and he had no patience for surprises, especially the kind that came wrapped in plain brown paper. When his assistant, Melanie, set the package on his desk that morning, Alex barely glanced at it. "What's this?" he asked, scrolling through emails on his tablet. "Courier dropped it off. No return address," she said, her tone neutral, though she knew better than to expect him to care about unsolicited deliveries. Alex frowned but waved her off. "Leave it." Hours passed. The package sat untouched, a stark anomaly amid the sterile efficiency of his workspace. By late afternoon, Alex's curiosity got the better of him. He set aside his tablet and picked up the package, examining it as if it might explode. It was light, the edges slightly crumpled, and when he tore it open, its contents were utterly mundane, and yet profoundly unsettling. A single pregnancy test. Positive. And a note, handwritten on a plain white card. "You deserve to know." For a moment, Alex stared at the items, his mind grinding to a halt. Then, the irritation set in. He let out a short, humorless laugh and tossed the test and the note onto his desk like someone discarding a bad joke. Was this someone's idea of a prank? A rival trying to rattle him? The absurdity of the situation made his jaw tighten. He pressed the intercom on his desk. "Melanie." "Yes, Mr. Thorne?" Her voice was calm, efficient. "Did the courier say who sent this?" "No, sir. They said it was strictly confidential." "Find out. Now." "Yes, sir." Alex ended the call and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he stared at the test. It was unnervingly deliberate, its anonymity, the message, the choice of delivery. It didn't feel random. His mind briefly flicked through the possibilities. Old flames? Opportunistic schemers? But no one came to mind. He was meticulous about keeping his personal and professional lives separate. Even the occasional relationships he allowed himself were casual, fleeting, and carefully managed. The longer he looked at the test, the more it began to unnerve him. Its simplicity carried weight. The note's message so direct, so sure, gnawed at the edges of his composure. The words weren't an accusation or a threat, yet they held a finality he couldn't ignore. He stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor. Grabbing the test and the note, he tossed them into the trash bin with more force than necessary. Melanie entered moments later. "I called the courier company. They said the sender paid in cash and refused to provide identification. No camera footage either. It was dropped off at a remote location." Alex cursed under his breath. "Forget it. Probably some pathetic attempt at attention." "Yes, sir," she said, turning to leave. But she hesitated at the door, her hand on the handle. "Should I have security look into it?" He shook his head. "No. It's irrelevant." Melanie nodded and left without another word. Alone again, Alex felt the room's silence press down on him. It was ridiculous to let something so trivial get under his skin, but he couldn't shake the faint, persistent unease. He prided himself on control over his empire, his image, his emotions. And yet this insignificant package had him on edge. He dismissed the thought with a scoff and turned his attention back to his tablet, diving into the endless demands of his business. By evening, the incident had faded to the back of his mind. Meetings, calls, and contracts occupied him, filling the hours with their familiar cadence. When he finally stepped into the private elevator that would take him down to the underground garage, the day felt like any other. But as the elevator doors closed, a faint reflection in the mirrored walls caught his attention. It wasn't the test or the note, it was his own expression. His jaw was clenched, his brows furrowed. He looked unsettled. Alex shook his head and looked away. Get a grip. The drive home was a blur. His penthouse apartment greeted him with its usual pristine luxury, muted lighting, designer furniture, and an expansive view of the city. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light as he stared out at the skyline. Normally, this view brought him a sense of accomplishment, a reminder of how far he'd come. Tonight it felt hollow. He took a sip of his drink and tried to rationalize his lingering unease. It was just a stupid prank. There was no reason to think otherwise. Yet, deep down, a nagging thought refused to be silenced. What if it wasn't? Alex tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to him like a shadow. He went to bed late, tossing and turning, and when he finally drifted off, his dreams were restless, filled with fragments of the day, glimpses of the test, the note, and a voice he couldn't quite place whispering, "You deserve to know." When he woke the next morning, the unease hadn't faded. It lingered in the edges of his mind, waiting. Something about that package had cracked the veneer of his meticulously controlled world, and no matter how hard he tried to dismiss it, the crack was widening. For the first time in years, Alexander Thorne felt like a man standing on unsteady ground, and he hated it. The morning arrived with the usual routine of efficiency and structure, but Alexander Thorne couldn't shake the strange weight pressing against his thoughts. The city buzzed outside the towering windows of his penthouse, vibrant and alive, yet he felt oddly detached from it all. He had spent the night restless, his mind stubbornly circling back to the package from the day before. It was ridiculous, he told himself again. A stupid prank. Nothing more. But no matter how hard he tried to bury it under the avalanche of emails and meetings waiting for him, the memory of the note's stark message refused to fade. He'd already had his assistant send security a quiet directive to comb through the building's surveillance footage. If there was any way to identify who had delivered the package, they'd find it. He had told Melanie it was a routine precaution, but he knew it was more than that. By the time Alex entered his private office, the morning sun streaming across the sleek black desk, he had convinced himself he'd moved on. The sharp trill of his desk phone cut through the quiet as he leaned back into his chair, ready to tackle the day. He glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment, he considered letting it go to voicemail. He hated unannounced calls, especially from unknown sources. But something stopped him, a small flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a trace of dread. He pressed the button to answer. Alexander Thorne? For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then, a voice he hadn't heard in months, soft but steady, cut through the line. Alex. It's Elena. His grip on the phone tightened. Her name hit him like a splash of cold water. Elena. A woman he had dated briefly last year, though. Dated might have been a stretch. Their connection had been passionate but fleeting, a spark quickly extinguished by the demands of his life. He'd ended things cleanly, or so he thought. What do you want? His voice was sharp, all business, though his pulse quickened. I need to see you, she said, her tone unnervingly calm. It's important. He frowned, already regretting picking up the call. I don't think we have anything to discuss. Her next words landed with a force that left him momentarily speechless. We need to talk. It's about the baby. For a moment, all Alex could hear was the faint hum of his office. He struggled to process the statement, his mind latching onto the word baby as if it were an alien concept. What are you talking about? He said finally, his voice low but dangerous. You heard me. Elena's calm facade cracked slightly, her voice trembling with a mix of determination and hesitation. I didn't know how to tell you before, but you deserve to know. I can explain everything if you meet me. Alex leaned back in his chair, the cool leather doing nothing to ground him. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. His first instinct was to call her bluff, accuse her of playing some elaborate game. But something in her voice, an edge of vulnerability, of truth, made him hesitate. I don't have time for games, Elena, he said coldly. If this is some ploy, it's not. she interrupted, her tone firm now. You can believe me or not, but we need to talk. I'll be at Bloom's Cafe at noon. If you care about knowing the truth, you'll be there. She hung up before he could respond, leaving him holding the phone in stunned silence. Alex stared at the receiver for a long moment before slamming it down on the desk. A dozen emotions warred within him: anger, disbelief, and underneath it all, a flicker of unease that refused to be ignored. The rest of the morning was a blur. He tried to immerse himself in work, but Elena's words played on a loop in his mind. He told himself it was absurd, that there was no way her claim could be true. He was careful, meticulously so. Still, doubts crept in. He remembered the spark they'd shared, the fleeting intimacy that had felt too raw, too real. He had cut it off before it could get messy, but had he missed something? Could there really be a child? By the time noon approached, Alex had made up his mind. He wasn't the kind of man to leave loose ends. If Elena thought she could disrupt his life with cryptic calls and baseless accusations, she was mistaken. He'd go to Bloom's, hear her out, and put this nonsense to rest. The cafe was a quaint spot on the edge of the financial district, its rustic charm a stark contrast to the sterile efficiency of Alex's world. He spotted Elena immediately. She sat near the window, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She looked different than he remembered, more tired perhaps, but there was a strength in her posture that hadn't been there before. He approached her table, his expression unreadable. "Elena," he said, taking the seat opposite her without waiting for an invitation. "I'm here. Talk." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," he said sharply. "You've got 5 minutes to explain yourself." Elena sighed, her fingers curling around the coffee cup in front of her. "I didn't want it to happen like this, Alex. I didn't plan for it. But I found out I was pregnant after we ended things. I thought about telling you then, but I wasn't sure how you'd react. And honestly," she hesitated, then met his gaze, "I didn't think you'd care." Alex's jaw tightened. "You think that little of me? I think you're a man who values control above all else," she said simply. "And this isn't something you can control." He leaned back, his expression cold. "Do you have proof, or am I just supposed to take your word for it?" Her eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her composure. "I thought you'd say that. I have everything you'll need: medical records, a paternity test if you want one. But that's not why I called you." "Then why?" he demanded. "Because I thought you deserved to know," she said softly. "Because I didn't want our child to grow up wondering who you were." The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. For the first time in years, Alex didn't have an immediate response. He stared at her, searching for any hint of deception, but all he saw was sincerity, and a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now. "I'll need time to process this." Elena nodded. "Take all the time you need. But Alex, don't wait too long." She stood, leaving him alone at the table, his carefully constructed world beginning to crack around him. Alexander Thorne sat alone at the cafe table long after Elena had left, her parting words echoing in his mind. "Don't wait too long." It wasn't a plea, it was a warning. He hated how it lingered, how it pulled at the edges of his carefully constructed reality. He hated that he had come here at all. The sound of nearby conversations drifted in and out, blending with the clinking of plates and the low hum of traffic outside. Alex ignored it all, his gaze fixed on the coffee cup Elena had left behind. The faint trace of her lipstick on the rim seemed to taunt him, a reminder that this wasn't some fleeting distraction. This was real, or at least she believed it was. By the time he left the cafe, the sun was high in the sky, and the heat of the day seemed to press down on him. His car waited at the curb, sleek and silent, the perfect reflection of his world, polished, efficient, and impenetrable. Yet for the first time in years, he felt cracks forming beneath the surface. The drive back to Thorne Tower was a blur. Alex replayed the conversation in his head, dissecting every word, every expression, every pause. Elena had looked him in the eye and told him she was pregnant with his child. There had been no hesitation, no trace of doubt. But that didn't mean she was telling the truth. Back in his office, Alex paced the floor, his thoughts churning. He didn't want to believe her, didn't want to accept the possibility that his life could be so profoundly disrupted by something, or someone, he had no control over. And yet, the nagging voice in the back of his mind wouldn't let him dismiss it outright. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before his assistant answered. "Melanie, clear my afternoon schedule. And get me the number for a private investigator, someone discreet." "Yes, Mr. Thorne," she replied without hesitation. Alex hung up and stared out the window, his reflection ghosting against the backdrop of the city. He wasn't a man who allowed himself to be blindsided. If Elena thought she could use this to manipulate him, she was about to learn how wrong she was. The next evening, Alex found himself in another cafe, not the quaint, rustic one where Elena had blindsided him, but a quieter, more private location. She had texted him earlier that day, her message brief and to the point. "We need to finish this conversation. Meet me at 8. He didn't reply. But he came. Elena was already there when he arrived, seated in a corner booth away from the main flow of customers. Her hands were folded on the table, her expression guarded but resolute. She looked tired, he noticed, more so than the day before. Yet there was a quiet strength about her that made it impossible to dismiss her outright. Alex slid into the seat across from her, his movements deliberate, his expression unreadable. "I assume you've brought the proof I asked for." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Hello to you too, Alex." He didn't respond, his gaze steady and unrelenting. After a moment, she sighed and reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. She placed it on the table between them, her hand lingering on it for just a second before letting go. "Everything's in there," she said. "Medical records. Ultrasound. The timeline adds up. If you want to do a paternity test, I won't stop you." Alex didn't touch the folder. "Why now, Elena? Why wait months to tell me?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You think this was easy for me? Do you have any idea how hard it was to even consider contacting you after the way things ended?" "You mean after I ended things," he corrected, his tone sharp. "And I'm starting to see why I made the right choice." Her expression hardened, the hurt flashing across her face for only a moment before she masked it. There it is. The cold, calculating Alex Thorne. God forbid anyone disrupts your perfect little world. He leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "If you think you can just show up out of nowhere and drop something like this in my lap, you're delusional." "People like you, people like me?" she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "What exactly does that mean, Alex? Go ahead, say it." He didn't flinch. "People who think they can trap someone like me." The words hung in the air like a slap. Elena's jaw tightened, her hands clenching into fists on the table. For a moment, Alex thought she might lash out, but instead, she pushed her chair back and stood. "You really think this is about trapping you?" she said, her voice shaking with anger. "I don't need your money, Alex. I don't need anything from you. But our child might. And whether you believe me or not, you'll have to live with the consequences of walking away." She grabbed her bag and slung it over her shoulder, her eyes blazing with a mix of fury and pain. "You can do whatever you want with that folder," she said, nodding toward the table. "Burn it for all I care. But don't say I didn't give you a chance." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Alex alone in the booth. He watched her go, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. For a long moment, he didn't move. The cafe seemed to fade into the background, the murmur of conversations and the clinking of dishes becoming a distant hum. All he could hear was her voice, replaying over and over. "You'll have to live with the consequences of walking away." Finally, he reached for the folder. His fingers brushed against the edge of it, hesitating before he pulled it toward him. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the documents inside. Medical records. Ultrasound images. Dates, names, facts that all seemed to align. The weight of it settled on him like a physical thing. For the first time, the possibility that Elena might be telling the truth felt real, terrifyingly real. Alex closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If what she said was true, everything he had built, everything he had controlled, was about to change. And there was nothing he hated more than losing control. The drive back to his penthouse that night was a silent one. The city lights blurred into streaks as Alexander Thorne gripped the steering wheel, his mind churning. The folder sat on the passenger seat, unopened since he'd left the cafe. Every so often, his eyes darted to it, as if it might spring open and force him to confront its contents again. When he finally arrived home, the vast emptiness of his penthouse greeted him with an almost oppressive quiet. The sleek furnishings and floor-to-ceiling windows that once symbolized his power and success now felt cold, unwelcoming. He tossed the folder onto the glass coffee table and poured himself a drink, the sharp burn of whiskey doing little to dull the unease in his chest. He sat in the dark, staring at the skyline, Elena's words echoing in his mind. "Don't say I didn't give you a chance." For the next few days, Alex buried himself in work, determined to regain his footing. Meetings, negotiations, and endless emails filled every waking hour. He told himself it was enough to drown out the nagging doubts, the intrusive thoughts about a future he hadn't planned for. But no matter how much he threw himself into his empire, the folder remained on his desk, unopened yet impossible to ignore. By the third day, Alex couldn't take it anymore. He had Melanie clear his schedule for the afternoon, and locked himself in his office. For hours, he pored over the documents, analyzing every detail with the precision he usually reserved for multi-million-dollar contracts. The ultrasound images were the hardest to look at, the tiny, blurry form on the screen stirring something unfamiliar and uncomfortable deep within him. It wasn't enough. He needed certainty. He made the call that evening, his tone clipped and businesslike as he arranged for a paternity test. The clinic was discreet, its reputation impeccable, exactly what he needed. The process was efficient, the results promised within a few days. He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Now, all he could do was wait. The waiting was unbearable. Alex had never been a man to second-guess himself, but now, doubt clung to him like a shadow. He replayed his interactions with Elena, scrutinizing every word, every expression, searching for cracks in her story. Yet, no matter how much he tried to convince himself that she was lying, a small, insistent voice in the back of his mind refused to be silenced. What if she's telling the truth? As the days dragged on, Alex found himself reflecting on the choices that had brought him to this point. His relationships, if they could even be called that, had always been fleeting, transactional. He avoided entanglements, viewing them as distractions from his goals. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, and fatherhood. That was a concept so foreign it felt almost laughable. But now, the possibility loomed large, forcing him to confront the gaps in his meticulously constructed life. He thought about his childhood, the father who had walked away, the mother who had struggled to hold their family together. Alex had promised himself he would never be like his father, never let anyone dictate the terms of his life. But had he gone too far in the other direction? Had his ambition turned him into the very thing he despised? The thought was uncomfortable, unsettling. He pushed it away, focusing instead on the numbers, the deadlines, the deals. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of the ultrasound from his mind. The tiny shape on the screen felt like a question he wasn't ready to answer. By the time the clinic called with the results, Alex was ready for the truth, whatever it might be. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but the words hit him like a punch to the gut. The test was conclusive. He was the father. For a moment, Alex couldn't speak. The room seemed to tilt around him, the weight of the revelation pressing down on his chest. He thanked the technician and ended the call, his hand trembling slightly as he set the phone down. He sat there for what felt like hours, the world outside his office fading into the background. The truth was undeniable now. There was no escaping it, no rationalizing it away. He was going to be a father. The realization was both terrifying and strangely grounding. For the first time in years, Alex felt something he couldn't quite name, a flicker of something raw and unfiltered, something that made the vast emptiness of his penthouse feel even more oppressive. That evening, he found himself standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city he had built his empire around. His reflection stared back at him, sharp and unyielding, a man who had spent his life chasing power and control. But now, he realized, there were things he couldn't control, things that didn't care about his wealth or influence. He thought about Elena, about the strength in her voice when she had said, "Our child might need you." He had dismissed her words at the time, but now they felt like a challenge, a call to step up, to be something more than the sum of his ambitions. For the first time, Alex allowed himself to imagine the future. It was a hazy, uncertain vision, filled with questions he didn't know how to answer. But at its center was the tiny life he had seen on that ultrasound, a life that was now undeniably connected to his own. The thought terrified him. But it also sparked something else, a quiet determination, a resolve to face whatever came next. Alex turned away from the window and picked up his phone. He hesitated for only a moment before dialing Elena's number. The line rang twice before she answered, her voice cautious but steady. "Alex. I got the results," he said, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk." There was a pause, and then she said, "I'll be at the cafe tomorrow at noon." Alex nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'll be there." He ended the call and set the phone down, his reflection once again staring back at him from the glass. But this time, there was something different in his expression, something that looked almost like resolve. For the first time in a long while, Alexander Thorne didn't feel like he had all the answers. But he was ready to start asking the right questions. The next day, Alex arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. For once, his carefully maintained schedule didn't feel like a shield but a reminder of how little control he actually had. The confirmation from the paternity test had settled one question but opened the door to many others, questions he wasn't prepared to face. Elena walked in at exactly noon, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. She spotted Alex immediately and made her way to the same corner table where they had sat before. Without waiting for him to speak, she slid into the chair opposite him and placed her bag on the seat beside her. "I take it you've seen the results?" she said, breaking the silence. Alex nodded, his jaw tight. "I have. It's not something I can ignore anymore." "Good," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Then we can start figuring out what happens next." He studied her, searching for any sign of the games he had feared she was playing. But Elena met his gaze steadily, her hands folded neatly on the table. For a moment, he almost admired her composure. "Before we talk about that," Alex said, leaning forward, "I need to know something." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. "The pregnancy test," he said. "And the note. Were you trying to force my hand?" Elena blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "The package," Alex pressed. "The test, the note, you deserve to know. Was that your way of getting my attention?" Her confusion shifted into a frown, and she shook her head. "I didn't send you anything, Alex." He stared at her, his skepticism hardening. "You expect me to believe that? You show up out of nowhere, claim I'm going to be a father, and then just conveniently deny sending the one thing that started all of this? I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her tone sharper now. "I didn't send you a package, and I certainly didn't write any notes." Alex leaned back, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowing as he tried to gauge her reaction. If she was lying, she was good at it. But there was something in her voice, an edge of genuine frustration, that gave him pause. "Then who did?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Elena's frown deepened, her gaze flickering to the window as she considered his question. "I don't know. I've told a few people. People I trust. My doctor, my sister. But none of them would do something like this." Alex shook his head, his thoughts racing. "Someone clearly wanted me to know, and they went out of their way to make sure I couldn't ignore it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the cafe buzzed around them, but Alex felt an eerie silence settle between them, a sense of something larger at play. Elena finally broke the silence, her voice quieter now. "You think someone close to you could have done it?" The idea had already crossed his mind, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel more real. "It wouldn't be the first time someone tried to manipulate me," he admitted. "But this feels different." Elena nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Someone who knows both of us, maybe? Or at least someone who knows about us." "Who could that be?" Alex asked, though his mind was already turning over possibilities. He was used to betrayal, it was practically a currency in his world. But this wasn't a hostile takeover or a power grab. This was personal. Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. "It has to be someone with enough access to know you wouldn't dismiss something like this entirely. Someone who knows how you think." Alex stared at her, the weight of her words settling heavily. His circle was small, deliberately so. But even within that limited sphere, there were people who might take it upon themselves to interfere. "Rachel," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Who?" Elena asked. "My sister," he replied, his tone clipped. "She's always had opinions about how I live my life. We don't talk much anymore, but she still knows enough to meddle." Elena studied him, her expression skeptical. "And you think she'd go this far?" Alex exhaled sharply, his frustration mounting. "I don't know. But if she did, she'll have answers." Elena nodded, though her wariness didn't fade. "Then maybe you should talk to her. Because if she's the one who did this, she's got a lot to answer for." Alex didn't need her to tell him twice. He stood abruptly, pulling out his phone as he walked away from the table. Elena watched him go, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. It took Alex less than an hour to track Rachel down. She was at her townhouse on the edge of the city, a cozy, unassuming place that felt worlds away from his sleek, sterile existence. He rang the doorbell, his jaw tight, his patience worn thin. Rachel opened the door moments later, her surprise evident as she took him in. "Alex? What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said, stepping past her into the house without waiting for an invitation. Rachel closed the door and followed him into the living room, her arms crossed. "You know, most people call first. This isn't a social visit," Alex said, turning to face her. "I need to know if you sent me something." Her brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "A package," he said, his tone sharp. "A pregnancy test. A note. You deserve to know. Did you send it?" Rachel's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she schooled her features. Alex saw it, and his frustration boiled over. "You did, didn't you?" he demanded. "Why? What the hell were you thinking?" Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "I didn't think you'd listen to me any other way, Alex. You've spent your entire life running from responsibility, from anything that might make you vulnerable. I couldn't let you ignore this. You had no right," Alex snapped. "This isn't your decision to make. And what would you have done if I hadn't?" She shot back. "Thrown it away? Pretended it didn't exist? You can't keep living like this, Alex. You can't keep shutting people out." Her words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. For a moment, he didn't respond, his anger warring with something else, something that felt uncomfortably close to shame. "This isn't your fight, Rachel," he said finally, his voice quieter but no less firm. "It is when it involves family," she replied. "Whether you like it or not, Alex, that baby is part of our family. And you needed to know." Alex stared at her, his mind racing. He hated the way she had gone behind his back, but he couldn't deny the truth in her words. She had forced his hand, yes, but maybe that was what it had taken to make him face reality. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained grim. "Stay out of it from now on," he said. "This is between me and Elena." Rachel didn't argue, but the look in her eyes said she wasn't sorry for what she'd done. Just don't mess this up, Alex. He didn't respond as he turned and left, his mind already spinning with what came next. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more complicated and more personal than he had ever anticipated. Alex drove back to his penthouse in silence, the encounter with Rachel replaying over and over in his mind. Her calm conviction, her refusal to back down, it all gnawed at him. She had admitted to sending the package without a shred of regret, even as he had leveled his anger at her. The audacity of it still made his blood boil. Yet, beneath the fury, there was something else. A faint, unwelcome voice whispering that Rachel might have been right. She claimed she acted out of necessity, not malice. That she had wanted him to face what he might otherwise ignore. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but the edges of her words stuck with him, echoing louder than he wanted to admit. By the time he reached his penthouse, the city lights were glinting through the massive windows, but the sight that usually gave him pride now felt hollow. He stepped inside, tossed his keys onto the counter, and made his way to the bar. Pouring himself a drink, he let out a sharp breath and stared into the amber liquid. Family. The word carried weight, a history that Alex had spent years trying to escape. Rachel had invoked it like a weapon, reminding him of the one thing he despised most, their father's legacy. The man who had walked away from them when they were children, leaving their mother to pick up the pieces. Alex had sworn he would never be like him, and yet here he was, teetering on the edge of a path that felt all too familiar. Rachel's words came back to him. You needed to know. The glass clinked loudly as he set it down on the counter, his jaw tightening. She had no right. None of this was her choice to make. Yet, the more he tried to dismiss her reasoning, the more it dug in, refusing to let go. The next morning, he decided he couldn't let it rest. The confrontation with Rachel had left too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions. He needed clarity, about her motives, about how much she had known, and most importantly, about how she had even found out in the first place. Rachel worked at a clinic just outside the city, a small, unassuming facility that specialized in women's health. Alex hadn't been there in years, but he remembered it well. Their mother had worked there before she passed, and Rachel had followed in her footsteps. It had been their mother's pride, a place that had felt like home to her. To Alex, it had been another reminder of a life he had fought to leave behind. He arrived mid-morning, walking through the front doors with his usual purposeful stride. The receptionist glanced up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of him. Alex Thorne wasn't the kind of man who went unnoticed, even in a place as unassuming as this. I'm here to see Rachel Thorne, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The receptionist stammered something about her being busy, but Alex brushed past her, heading down the hallway toward Rachel's office. He didn't knock. He opened the door and stepped inside, his presence filling the small space. Rachel looked up from her desk, startled but quickly regaining her composure. Alex, she said, setting down the file she'd been reading. What are you doing here? We're not done, he said flatly, closing the door behind him. You owe me an explanation. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. I thought I already gave you one. You told me what you did, Alex said, his voice cold. Now I want to know how. How did you even know about Elena? About the baby? Rachel's expression shifted, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she straightened her posture. Elena came here for her first appointment, she admitted. I recognized her name. And when I saw the file, she trailed off, shaking her head. I knew it was yours. Alex stared at her, his disbelief mounting. You went through her medical records? Rachel bristled. I didn't invade her privacy. I was doing my job, Alex. But when I realized what was happening, I couldn't just ignore it. That wasn't your decision to make, he snapped. You had no right to interfere in my life like that. Rachel's eyes flashed with anger. And you had no right to walk away from something this important. Do you even hear yourself, Alex? You're so caught up in your world of deals and power plays that you can't see what really matters. He shook his head, pacing the small office. You don't get to lecture me about what matters. You crossed the line, Rachel. I did what I had to, she said, her voice firm. Because I wasn't going to stand by and watch you make the same mistakes he did. Alex froze, the weight of her words slamming into him. Don't, he warned, his voice low. Don't bring him into this. Why not? Rachel shot back. You've spent your entire life trying to prove you're nothing like him, but here you are, ready to abandon your own child just like he abandoned us. That's not what this is, Alex said, his voice rising. I didn't even know, and now you do. Rachel interrupted. So what are you going to do about it? Her question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Alex stared at her, his chest heaving, his mind racing. He hated that she had forced him into this position, hated that she had dredged up wounds he thought he had buried long ago. But most of all, he hated that she was right. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, the unspoken history between them filling the silence. Finally, Rachel sighed, her voice softening. I didn't do this to hurt you, Alex, she said. I did it because I know you. You're stubborn and proud, and you would have ignored this if you could. But this isn't just about you. It's about that baby. It's about breaking the cycle. Alex ran a hand through his hair, the anger slowly draining from his expression. He didn't want to admit it, but her words had struck a chord. He had spent his life running from his father's shadow, determined to be better, to be stronger. But in his pursuit of power and control, had he lost sight of what that actually meant? I need time, he said finally, his voice quieter now. To figure out what to do. Rachel nodded, her expression softening. Take all the time you need. But don't take too long. That baby doesn't deserve to be another casualty of our family's mistakes. Alex didn't respond as he turned and walked out of the office, his thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. For the first time in years, he felt truly uncertain about the path ahead. But one thing was clear, there was no going back. The days following his confrontation with Rachel were some of the longest Alex had ever endured. He threw himself into work, burying himself in contracts and negotiations, desperate to reclaim the sense of control that had been slipping from him ever since that package arrived. Yet, no matter how many deals he closed or emails he sent, the thoughts gnawed at him. Rachel's words lingered, her accusations echoing louder than he wanted to admit. You're so caught up in your world of deals and power plays that you can't see what really matters. It was an uncomfortable truth, one that forced him to reevaluate not only the choices he had made but the man he had become. One night, alone in his penthouse, Alex found himself looking at the ultrasound image he had once shoved into a drawer. The blurry, indistinct shape that represented his child was almost mesmerizing now. He stared at it for a long time, his chest tightening with emotions he couldn't name. Responsibility. Guilt. Maybe even the faintest flicker of hope. He knew he couldn't keep running. Not from Rachel's pointed truths, not from Elena's challenges, and certainly not from the life that was about to change his own. If nothing else, he owed Elena an apology, for doubting her, for accusing her, and for making her shoulder this alone. It was a realization he had resisted for too long, but now it felt inescapable. The next morning, Alex made the call. Elena answered after the second ring, her voice cautious. Alex. I need to see you, he said, his tone steadier than he felt. There's a lot I need to say. Elena was quiet for a moment, then replied, I'm free this afternoon. They met in the same cafe as before, though the tension between them now was different, softer, less combative. Elena sat across from him, her expression guarded but calm. Alex felt a pang of guilt as he looked at her, remembering the last time they'd sat here and the accusations he'd thrown at her. I owe you an apology, he said, breaking the silence. For doubting you. For everything I said. You didn't deserve that. Elena blinked, her surprise evident. For a moment, she simply stared at him, as if waiting for the catch. When none came, her shoulders relaxed slightly. Thank you, she said quietly. I wasn't sure if I'd ever hear that. Alex nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. About us, about the baby. And the truth is, I've handled it all wrong. I let my fear of losing control get in the way of what really matters. Elena's expression softened, though there was still a hint of wariness in her eyes. And what do you think matters? The baby, Alex said firmly. Being there. Being a part of their life. I want to step up, Elena. I know I've given you every reason to doubt me, but I'm serious about this. I want to do it right. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. You're not just saying this because Rachel pushed you into it, are you? Alex shook his head. Rachel gave me a shove, yes, but this is my decision. It took me longer than it should have, but I'm here now. Elena nodded slowly, her expression shifting from guarded to contemplative. If you're serious, Alex, then there are some things we need to talk about. Boundaries, expectations, and trust. This isn't going to work unless we're on the same page. I understand, Alex said. And I'm ready to work for it. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained cautious. Then let's start with the basics. I have another appointment next week. You should come. I will, he said without hesitation. Just tell me when and where. For the first time since the package arrived, Alex felt a small measure of relief. It wasn't a resolution, not entirely, but it was a start. The following week, Alex found himself sitting in a waiting room filled with expectant parents and the hum of quiet conversations. The environment was foreign to him, so far removed from the boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations that defined his life. Yet, as uncomfortable as it felt, he knew he needed to be here. Elena arrived a few minutes later, her face lighting up briefly with surprise at seeing him already seated. You're early, she said, sitting beside him. I figured this wasn't the kind of thing I should be late for, he replied, his tone dry but sincere. The appointment itself was a revelation. As they sat in the dimly lit ultrasound room, the sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the space, a steady, rhythmic thrum that seemed to echo in Alex's chest. For the first time, the abstract concept of fatherhood became something tangible, something real. That's them, the technician said with a smile, pointing to the screen. Healthy and growing right on schedule. Alex stared at the image, his throat tightening. He hadn't known what to expect, but the sight of his child, a tiny, unmistakable form, hit him harder than he could have imagined. He glanced at Elena, who was watching the screen with a small, wistful smile, and felt a surge of gratitude toward her he couldn't quite put into words. After the appointment, they walked out together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. Thank you for coming, Elena said quietly. It means a lot. I'll be there for the rest of them, too, Alex said, his voice steady. You won't have to do this alone. She nodded, her smile softening. We'll see how this goes. One step at a time. Alex agreed, knowing there was no other way forward. Over the next few weeks, they began to find a rhythm. It wasn't always easy, there were moments of tension, moments when Alex's instinct to take control clashed with Elena's insistence on independence. But gradually, they began to build something that resembled a partnership. Alex attended every appointment, asked questions, and even began preparing for the baby's arrival in his own way. He surprised Elena one day by showing her a small nursery he'd started setting up in his penthouse, complete with neutral tones and carefully chosen furniture. It's nice, Elena said, clearly trying to contain her surprise. I didn't expect you to be so hands-on. I don't do anything halfway, Alex replied, his tone light but genuine. As the weeks turned into months, Alex began to feel something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond profits and power. The baby became more than an obligation, it became a reason to be better, to do better. One evening, as he sat in the nursery, staring at the crib he had just finished assembling, Alex realized that Rachel's intervention, as infuriating as it had been necessary. Without it, he might never have faced the truth or taken the steps to become the father he now wanted to be. He picked up his phone and sent a single text to Rachel, "Thank you." Her response came quickly, "You're welcome. Now don't screw this up." For the first time in weeks, Alex smiled. He didn't plan to. The months passed in a blur of preparations, appointments, and small moments of learning to coexist with Elena in a way that neither of them had anticipated. Their relationship remained a cautious partnership, built on mutual respect rather than the lingering emotions of their past. Alex found himself drawn into a world that once felt foreign but was now slowly becoming familiar. From choosing baby names to assembling strollers, his life became less about power suits and board meetings and more about creating a foundation for the tiny life they were about to welcome. It wasn't always smooth. There were arguments, miscommunications, and moments when Alex's instinct to control everything clashed with Elena's need to maintain her independence. But through it all, they found ways to compromise, their shared goal keeping them aligned. As Elena's due date approached, Alex felt a sense of anticipation unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was a mix of anxiety and excitement, a new kind of pressure that made every other challenge in his life seem trivial. He had spent years navigating high-stakes deals and negotiating with some of the most powerful people in the world, but nothing had prepared him for this. The call came in the middle of the night. Alex had just returned to his penthouse after a long day when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He answered immediately, his heart racing when he heard Elena's voice on the other end. "It's time," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "I'm at the hospital." "I'm on my way," Alex replied, grabbing his coat and heading for the door without a second thought. The drive to the hospital was a blur. The streets were eerily quiet, the city asleep under a blanket of stars. Alex gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with everything he wanted to say to Elena and everything he wanted to promise his child. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he knew he had to be. When he arrived, the hospital was bustling, its fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the stillness of the night outside. A nurse directed him to Elena's room, and he found her sitting upright in the bed, her face pale but determined. She looked up when he entered, and for a brief moment, their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. "You made it," she said, her voice soft. "Of course I did," Alex replied, taking a seat beside her. "I'm not going anywhere." The hours that followed were some of the longest and most intense of Alex's life. He stayed by Elena's side, holding her hand, offering words of encouragement that felt clumsy but heartfelt. He marveled at her strength, his respect for her growing with every passing moment. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the hospital windows, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. Alex's breath caught as the nurse placed the tiny, wriggling bundle in Elena's arms. He stood frozen, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't quite name. Elena looked up at him, her eyes shining with exhaustion and joy, and she nodded toward the baby. "Do you want to hold her?" she asked. Alex hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out. The nurse helped him cradle the baby in his arms, and as he looked down at his daughter for the first time, the world seemed to shift. She was so small, her delicate features perfect and fragile. Her tiny fingers curled around his thumb, and in that moment, Alex felt a wave of love so overwhelming it nearly brought him to his knees. He had spent his entire life building walls, protecting himself from vulnerability, but now those walls crumbled, leaving him exposed in the best possible way. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Elena smiled, her exhaustion evident but her pride unmistakable. "She has your eyes." Alex glanced down at his daughter, his heart swelling. He had spent so much time fearing this moment, fearing the responsibility and the unknown, but now all he felt was an unshakable resolve. He would be the father she deserved, the kind of father he had never had. "I'll never let her down," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "I swear." The words felt like a vow, one he intended to keep no matter what. For the first time, Alex understood what it meant to truly care for someone beyond himself, beyond his ambitions. This tiny life in his arms had redefined everything. The hours after the birth were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. Alex stayed by Elena's side, his protective instincts kicking in as he watched over both her and their daughter. The hospital room felt like a bubble, separate from the rest of the world, and for once, Alex didn't mind. Here, in this moment, nothing else mattered. When it was finally time to take their daughter home, Alex drove carefully, his usual confidence replaced by an almost comical level of caution. Elena laughed softly from the passenger seat, cradling the baby in her arms. "You're driving like you're transporting priceless cargo," she teased. "I am," Alex replied, his eyes fixed on the road. Back at his penthouse, the nursery he had painstakingly prepared felt complete for the first time. Alex watched as Elena settled the baby into the crib, her movements gentle and practiced. He stood in the doorway, his chest tight with a mixture of pride and gratitude. As the evening wore on, the city lights outside the window began to twinkle, casting a soft glow over the room. Alex found himself standing by the window, his daughter cradled in his arms. She had fallen asleep, her tiny breaths rhythmic and steady, and he couldn't take his eyes off her. For so long, he had defined himself by his achievements, by the empire he had built. But now, as he looked out over the city skyline with his daughter in his arms, he realized that none of it compared to this. Love, connection, family, these were the things that truly mattered. Elena appeared beside him, her presence warm and grounding. "You're a natural," she said softly, nodding toward the baby. Alex smiled, his gaze never leaving his daughter. "I've had a good teacher." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past months finally giving way to a quiet sense of peace. For the first time in years, Alex felt whole. As the city buzzed quietly below, Alex tightened his hold on his daughter and made a silent promise. He would be there for her, no matter what. He would break the cycle, not just for her but for himself, too. Because in the end, love and connection weren't weaknesses, they were his greatest strengths. If you enjoyed this story of transformation, responsibility, and love, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire and resonate. What did you think of Alex's journey? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.